obligations on all of us to join the struggles of Indigenous peoples with Black and Brown peoples to address the issues mentioned above. This could also include Caribbean reparations movements incorporating this issue into their actions. There is a complex history in all these places of bodies that have been stolen and moved without choices, under the guise of choice. It is important for us to think about the impacts of colonialism in these places and how it continues to operate in all the issues we will be discussing today.
Cool. Thank you so much, Moilene.
Welcome.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful, beautiful. All right. So what we're going to do next is we're going to hear from Shane Martinez. Shane is a member of Justice for Migrant Workers. He's a criminal and human rights lawyer here in the Toronto, the GTA area. Shane's involvement with Justice for Migrant Workers began, I believe, in 2008 or 2009. He undertook some of the first big human rights cases, including the Adrian Monroe's, which was a precedent-setting decision at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. Shane has been the lawyer involved for representing the 54 workers since 2015, 2016. So for a very long time, he's been involved in this case. So I just want to turn it over to Shane, and Shane's going to be providing a bit of a overview what happened, some of the insights that came up during the 5 days of cross-examination. And turn it over to you, Shane.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Moilene. Yeah, so it's great to see everybody tonight. I guess we'll have kind of a high-level discussion about what's transpired with the case, and for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with it, I'll kind of do a bit of a recap. So back in October of 2013, the Ontario Provincial Police were conducting an investigation into an allegation of sexual assault in the Tillsonburg area in Southern Ontario. And during the course of that investigation, they had an opportunity to obtain a description of a suspect. In our view, it was a fairly detailed description. It contained information relating to the height, the body type, facial features, skin color, approximate age, and so on of the suspect. And what the police did when they had that description is that they, by and large, ignored it. And instead of trying to find in the community who matched the description of the suspect and doing traditional police sleuthing and investigative work, or community-based policing, where you engage members of the community and try and have them assist you in a meaningful, respectful service. And what that consisted of was the police, the Ontario Provincial Police, going around to all of the migrant workers in a particular area and soliciting DNA samples from them testing. They solicited samples from people, even if they did not match the description of the suspect at all and could not possibly have been the suspect. They solicited samples from people that not only didn't match the description, but also people that had verifiable alibis as well as to where they were at on the night of the offense. This involved the police going to migrant workers who were between the heights of approximately 5'2" and 6'5", migrant workers who weighed between 110 pounds and 320 pounds, workers with long dreadlocks, workers who were bald, workers who were clean shaven, ones with large beards, workers who were Black, workers who were brown from Trinidad. There was a wide array of descriptions of workers, and they went after DNA samples from all of them. At the end of it, after 40 days had gone by, the police realized that they had missed people during the course of their investigation. This caused them to end up zoning in on some particular individuals who they had missed, and by zoning in on those individuals, They were able to find people who were of interest. They asked them for DNA samples. One of them did not comply. Other people during the course of the investigation, a handful of them didn't provide samples either, but 40 days in, they came across somebody who they had not gotten a sample from earlier. And when that person refused, they ended up putting surveillance on them and ended up getting what was called a discard sample of DNA, which means that, for example, when the person drinks out of a pop can or eats a slice of pizza and cleans their mouth with a napkin, they obtained those items and then ran DNA tests on them to see if they were a match for the DNA that was recovered at the scene, and ultimately it was, and they arrested that individual, again, well over a month after the crime had actually occurred. So the police end up making arrests. The person enters a guilty plea, and then years later, approximately 2 years later, a group of 54 workers who were impacted by this end up bringing human rights applications before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. The Ontario Provincial Police tried to fight those applications. They tried to have them dismissed, claiming that they were untimely. The applicants were able to overcome that hurdle. Then the Ontario Provincial Police tried to have the applications effectively paused or held in abeyance pending the outcome of a class action that was somewhat related to these proceedings. Again, they failed in that effort as well, and the tribunal said, no, these workers have been waiting years to have their day before the tribunal to have these matters addressed. And the tribunal said, these cases are going to go ahead. So what we saw was late last month, the matter finally proceeded to a hearing. Again, this incident, the DNA collection, took place in October of 2013. So 8 years later, essentially, the matter was finally making its way to a hearing before the tribunal. Now, at the tribunal, we called evidence from one of the migrant farm workers, Leon Logan. We also called expert evidence from a professor who is a specialist in migrant studies, Dr. Jenna Hennebrey. And so we called evidence from those two witnesses, and the police called evidence as well from a number of police officers, very high-ranking officials with the Ontario Provincial Police, both ones who are currently employed and some who have since retired, all of whom were involved, though, in the investigation in some way, shape, or form. And we learned a lot of new things during the course of that investigation. During the course of the hearing. What we learned was that it only took the Ontario Provincial Police a number of hours, talking about 3-4 hours, from the time that the incident was reported to them to when they made a decision that, you know what, it would be appropriate to conduct a DNA sweep in these circumstances. They determined that it would be appropriate to conduct a DNA sweep before they even knew if any DNA had been collected at the crime scene. They also made the decision to conduct a DNA sweep before the victim in this situation had ever even been interviewed by the police. Now, the hearing, they were frontline in the field collecting the DNA samples, or the higher up ones. None of them had any experience or training whatsoever in carrying out a DNA sweep. So we saw these officers come to the conclusion that they were going to carry out an investigative technique that none of them had any experience in whatsoever before they even knew if they had any evidence to compare the DNA samples of migrant workers to. So that was just one of many things that was revealed at the hearing. Other things that came out, and I won't go over them all, we may have a chance to kind of talk about it in a moment, but other things that came out during the course of the hearing were that, for example, migrant workers provided alibis to the police when they were asked for samples of their DNA. On not one occasion, not a single occasion did the police ever investigate those alibis. They, you know what, thanks for telling us that, but we still want your DNA. By comparison, at one point in the investigation, the police realized that they had not obtained DNA samples from a group of about 50 workers who were being brought into the area from a nearby farm. However, when a white manager on the farm was able to provide an alibi for those workers and said, oh, you don't have to worry about them. They were driven in on the bus and they were taken out at the end of the day. The police accepted that alibi on behalf of all of those workers without verifying it whatsoever, and essentially took it as being valid. Whereas anytime that a Black or brown worker tried to provide an alibi, it was disregarded by the police. We also know that the police did things such as showing the composite sketch of the suspect. The description that the victim provided was detailed enough that the police were able to produce a composite sketch. They showed that to white people in the community to try and see if they could assist with the investigation, but they did not take the common sense approach of showing it to any Black or brown person in the community, any migrant worker who might actually be able to say, I recognize that individual, I know who that is. So that was another example of differential treatment. There were a number of others as well that we may get to later. I know that some other folks are going to be talking on this. The last thing that I'll mention is just kind of where we're at right now and what the Human Rights Tribunal is going to be doing at the next stage of this case, which is going to be coming up in February, when it has to receive closing submissions from the parties and apply the necessary legal tests. So the workers themselves have an onus to establish that there was discrimination, and they have to show that on what's called a balance of probabilities. So they have to basically show to the tribunal that it was more probable than not that the actions of the Ontario Provincial Police were discriminatory. And in doing that, there's three key things that they have to show. They have to show that they have a characteristic that's protected by the Human Rights Code, which they do, which is their race and their ethnicity and their country of origin as well. They also have to demonstrate to the tribunal that they experienced adverse treatment or impact in a social area under the code. And it's our position that they've also done that because they've been able to show that they were adversely impacted by this discriminatory and oppressive investigative technique, the DNA sweep that was carried out by the Ontario Provincial Police. And policing is, of course, a service, which is considered to be a social area under the code. And third, the workers have to show that the protected characteristic, so in other words, their race, their nationality, for example, was a factor in the adverse treatment that they experienced. And this was very clearly shown during the course of the hearing as well, where the police readily admitted that yes, race was a factor in their decision to target these individuals for samples of their DNA. Now, establishing discrimination as well, it can get a little bit more nuanced than that. So that's the basic test, but then we have to look at how the tribunal assesses the evidence that's before it. So there's a number of factors that the tribunal looks at. The prohibited ground or grounds of discrimination doesn't have to be the sole or even the major factor that leads to the discriminatory conduct. It's sufficient if it is a factor, right? So the police don't have to only go after a migrant worker in this instance because of their color of their skin. So long as that was one of the factors, that's sufficient. It doesn't have to be the sole factor in the reasoning of the police. Also, there's no need to establish an intention or a motivation to discriminate. The focus of the inquiry is on the effect of the respondent's actions on the complainant. That's another way of saying that intentions are really by and large irrelevant here. We know where the road that is paved with good intentions can lead to. The intention of the person that's engaging in the discriminatory conduct is really irrelevant. It's about the impact that it has on the person that was on the receiving end. Also, the prohibited conduct, the prohibited ground or grounds need not be the cause of the respondent's discriminatory conduct. It's sufficient if they are a factor or an operative element, which is what we had kind of touched on just a moment ago. In addition to that, there need be no direct evidence of discrimination. And this is important because the tribunal has long acknowledged that discrimination will more often than not be proven by circumstantial evidence and inference, right? It's very rare that you have direct evidence that somebody was trying to against another person. You have to look at the totality of the circumstances and this constellation of factors that is existing around a particular interaction between the police and individuals in society to determine whether or not there was discrimination. And finally, racial stereotyping will usually be the result of subtle unconscious beliefs, biases, or prejudices. Although racial stereotyping is one way of looking at this interaction in the DNA sweep, it's not the sole way of looking at it. You can have discrimination even in the absence of. So this is just kind of a summary of the legal tests and the factors that the tribunal will be applying. And I look forward to speaking with all of you a bit more about that, should you have any questions about the case. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shane. That was really insightful. And I think you covered a lot there. So just a reminder for everybody who's joined a little bit late, this session is being recorded. And hopefully we'll figure how to distribute this a little bit later on. So we're going to go back to Moilene. Moilene Samuels is a member of Justice for Migrant Workers. Moilene was actively involved with the Harvesting the Freedom campaign. She's been involved with the Migrant Voices, our radio show, and been on the ground helping us through thick and thin over the last couple of years. So Moilene's going to give us a little discussion, reflection about why this is a community issue and why people should care. So Moilene, over to you.
Yes, welcome everyone. Those who were here earlier and those who joined us recently, lately. Yes, one of the happiest moments recently as a member of Justice for Migrant Workers and have been traveling out to the farms and speaking with the workers and our campaigns and gatherings and so on and so forth, is when I heard that 5th determined, brave warrior migrant farm workers were going to have another day in court led by stalwart lawyer Shane Martinez. This was a historical moment for our Black and Brown communities, both here in Canada and back home. You know, as the human rights case progressed in court, I started feeling all the feels. I was in tears at one point when my Jamaican Black brother, migrant worker, were relaying to the court what happened to him during the process of his this DNA harvesting process. He started by, he stated, pardon me, how he felt. He felt sad, he felt defeated, humiliated, how demoralizing the process made him feel. Yes, that was really touching for me. I was in tears. You know, how he in this situation, he know that something wasn't right. He know that he should be speaking to maybe a lawyer, somebody, maybe his Justice for Migrant Workers or a support team or somebody, right? But for fear of losing his job, he did not. He did not. He went along, even though he wasn't comfortable doing this. And, you know, that just shows that the workers' rights are being taken away, especially during that time when they were, as I use the word coral, they were coral, together. They were rounded up. I hope this is this is what I believe. They were rounded up. They were coral, and they had their DNA taken, right? And on top of that, as for the information, they were promised that the DNA would be destroyed. However, it wasn't. It was found out later that the DNA was still stored. As a Black person myself from the Caribbean, this was very troubling. It was very troubling for me, and it should be troubling for our Black and Brown communities. Yes, the reason for this is cases such as this can serve as a gateway for more abuses, a gateway for more discriminative conducts and tactics where migrant workers are concerned. For example, we see in the States where in the news almost daily, where Black and Brown brothers and sisters are being killed. This happened because the law enforcement believe that they will get away with it, or they will always get away with it, until the communities stood up and said, no, no, not again. No, you will not get away with it this time. This time we're going to stand together. This time we're going to fight together. We're going to do everything in our power to get justice for our fallen brothers and sisters. Until then, and as we also saw in the news a while back, yes, standing together, fighting together for justice for fallen brothers and sisters were achieved. Right? The wider community, Black and Brown community, we have to band together. We have to come together. We have to stand together against cases such as this, right? So that, you know, cases like, as I mentioned, in the States, cases like what happened to our migrant farm workers here in Canada, and cases prior to this one will not happen again. At least we'll get the attention of the government and the necessary bodies, right, to let them know that we will not stand for any more of the wrongs that have been done to our workers, to our Black brothers and sisters. Yes, and Chris, I will turn it over to you at this
point.
Thank
you. That was beautiful.
Yes, welcome.
So that was two amazing presentations so far. So a couple of things before we move on to Adrian. So number one, remember, the police or the popo, they lied to the migrant workers. All right, they said that they will destroy the samples. It was never destroyed. It's held forever in a database in Toronto. Okay, so that's really important. Yes. Number two, the way that they treated the migrant workers involved in this case was that they thought they could pounce on them for their vulnerability and get away with it. Number three, they didn't expect for the workers to fight back, which was really, really beautiful. And both Shane and Moilene have highlighted that. So that was beautiful. I just also wanted to let you know that the next day of hearings, the final day will be February 1st. And we want to try to get as many people as possible to join that. And we'll probably be doing a call to action sometime in January prior to the case. So we'll also be making sure that y'all know about that. And to give you kind of a geographic understanding where people are coming from today, we got peeps in Trinidad, we got peeps in Jamaica, we got peeps across the United States, across Canada, across Quebec, joining this conversation. Many of the brothers and comrades involved in the case are on this meeting tonight, as well as people from the feds and the province are here as well too. And community activists from almost all different walks of life. So thanks for everybody to be joining today. So our next person will be Dr. Adrian Smith. Adrian did his PhD at McGill University. He's been a longtime member of Justice for Migrant Workers, involved in multiple cases, such as he's been involved in the organizing, he's been involved in the strategy, the political mobilization, the legal work. And I think the most critical work is the two components is organizing with workers, but also teaching young people and younger lawyers about what are the radical traditions in lawyering. So big it up to Adrian. You're next.
All right, thanks for that intro. Good evening, everybody. Good to be with you all this evening. I'm wondering if you can allow me to share the screen if that's okay, whoever's got control. I thought Chris had done that. Sorry for that.
You want me to try to share the screen?
I want to share the screen. Yeah. You missed that text.
You have to make him co-host, Chris. Go to participants.
All right.
And then you'll see Adrian's name.
Okay.
And then you'll see these lines. And then there'll be something called a more, M-O-R-E. And then it says make co-host.
All right. Give me a second.
Adrian is causing problems already.
I'm sorry, it's my nature. I come by it honestly.
Okay, all right, hold on. Is make co-host. All right, I think I did that.
All right.
Okay, all right, you're now co-host. So now I just share. Hold on. All right, I don't know how to do that, Adrian. Sorry. You just gotta tell me what to do. Oh, you're good? All right, all yours.
Okay, sorry about the delay there, folks. Thanks for your patience. Thanks, Chris, for the technical intervention there.
Wow.
So I want to speak, if I can, quite quickly, not necessarily deeply, but across what I've witnessed over the many years that this has occurred, this case has been in place, and also about the report written by OPERD, which is in effect a police watchdog, like most police watchdogs, which has no teeth and no fortitude, and their report called Casting the Net. And I want to try to capture all of that within what I'm calling 15 theses. So, sorry for that. Let's see here. So in the OPERD report on this very DNA sweep, they reached the understanding that while the sweep itself, the canvassing as they call it, was overly broad, it was not based on stereotypical assumptions about migrant workers or persons of color. They also said that it was perfectly understandable why it would have been perceived by workers as though it was discriminatory or based on stereotypes, but in fact it lacked intent or motivation to discriminate. As Shane pointed out, in the Human Rights Tribunal context, the point about intent and motivation is besides the point. It's about the impacts and effects. To be honest, it should have been true for the police watchdog as well, but we know how those folks roll. So here's what the police watchdog said. While I'm satisfied that the OPP investigation was not motivated by racial prejudice, the nature and scope of the DNA canvass was overly broad and had an impact on migrant workers' sense of vulnerability. And then they make this claim about needing a more focused canvass or sweep the next time to reduce concerns about racial profiling. I want to try to take down those kinds of points. So I'm going to do this in 15 theses. And in doing that, I want to start by saying that this really comes from my observation of the hearings and the really brilliant interrogation that Shane engaged in. Normally we think of the police interrogating us. In this case, quite importantly, Shane turned the tables on them, and we learned a great deal. And of course, Shane turning the tables on that could not have happened without the workers themselves. The really important stand that these workers have taken, and it's a collective stand, and I want us to remember that. Okay. To believe the DNA sweep is not motivated by racial prejudice is to focus on intention and such an enduring social presence that engulfs, that encapsulates the social relations in which these workers live. That should be deeply troubling to us, but I want to speak here specifically those academics who continue to write about migrant work in a way that treats racialization and racism as though it's as they would say, an epiphenomenon. And I'm speaking here specifically to my radical comrades on the left who, while importantly speaking about migrant workers, say nothing about the racialized and racist dimensions of this scheme. It's unacceptable. Second thesis, we learn here that it's not just the growers who are cultivating things, it's the police and their watchdog who are cultivating. There was consent for this DNA canvas. They received a consent sample from the workers. Everyone was going to be asked for consent. Everyone would be asked for a consent sample. Those were the types of phrases we heard time and again as Shane interrogated the police, and they rested their arguments on the liberal construction of consent, which is quite deeply troubling and problematic. Here, they're trying to say that the ends of this sweep justified the means. The victim directed us, they said, to migrant worker through the suspect description. And of course, it ended up being true. That's what they're saying. So then the sweep is justified. It would have been a misstep to stay so, and this is the opposite of the one where we were pushed on the fact that they didn't stay closely, they didn't closely adhere to the suspect description in bringing in all kinds of workers. Then they said it would have been a mistake to stay so closely aligned with that suspect description. So they wanted to play both sides there. I think I skipped one there. Beyond incompetence, it's not the incompetence of the police, but rather it's a way of seeing. It's a way of perceiving the social world and their place within the relations of that social world. Some scholars have talked about it, that is visuality. The DNA sweep is a projection of power over and within the grower migrant worker relationship. And this is what I think Shane's interrogation rendered visible for us that was otherwise invisible. Here they talked about saving us from the departed.
Lotto 619, Lotto
The sweep is justified because harvest season is over, workers are returning home. Just as we hear about concerns about migrant workers' arrival and their temporary existence in local communities, as we've heard that for a long time now. Here we hear about their departure, right? It's their departure that threatens the community and threatens community safety. Again, they want to have both sides of this. And I could go into the real details here where they had this general description as Shane described, and they drew in workers who were decades older, 100 and more pounds heavier, who had full-grown beards when the description said the person was cleanly shaved, who had brown and black skin. Irrespective of what they looked like, the police treated everyone as they said, potential suspects. The DNA sweep cannot be divorced from the wider structural features of this program and of our society. Here we can start talking about the mixing of coercion and compulsion, the economic and extra economic compulsion that goes into creating this program. We see the coercive dimensions of this policing technique adjoining and mirroring the mixing of the coercion and the compulsion exercised by growers and the state in this program. We see the police, the state capital, carrying out their coercive actions in and through the investigation of a violent sexual assault in the context of a society in which gendered violence is not taken seriously enough. Our aim should be to take seriously the violence of police actions and no less seriously the existence of the gendered dimensions of this sexualized violence and its pervasiveness in our society. The challenge is, to borrow the words of Jared Sexton, how to theorize and to politicize violence in the midst of violence, to indicate the wetness of water while being submerged in. So the police and the production of community and its members. What are the rules and the norms that the OPP are bound by? They perceive themselves as above and beyond the obligations of anti-discrimination laws, those liberal human rights constructs. Any infringement of these rights is self-evidently justified or justifiable on their terms. The police have quite explicitly and unapologetically set themselves above law. I wonder what the victim, or more broadly, what any victim of violence of this kind of violent assault would wish for the perpetrator. Would they wish for the perpetrator to be caught by any means necessary, including by treating migrant workers, all migrant workers, as perpetrators, as suspects, as potential suspects? What might victims say about the fact that the notions of crime in societies like ours are constructed such that a group already vulnerable is captured by and in the midst and in this wider ambit? I wonder. We can tweak or alter the police rules of conduct in carrying out DNA sweeps, but none of this fundamentally changes the role of the police in this construction, in this production of settler capitalist order. The humanity of one through the inhumanity of the other. The police claim to restore or secure the humanity of one, this victim of this violent assault, and they do this by guaranteeing to the rest of us the inhumanity of another, the other, or the migrant. If nothing else, this is just the white man's burden being perpetuated, in which the white settler man is our savior. It's DNA for survival. Why provide DNA? Workers noted that they felt they had no choice. If they refused to provide it, they feared retribution or reprisal from the employers. They would not be named or called back. It's DNA for survival. The figure of the migrant. The migrant fits into this what we could call a social legal taxonomy. They are not a person, but part of a system of social legal classification. The migrant must be different from the non-migrant. The state and capital work to ensure the ongoing supply of this pliable labor. This spans more or less all areas of law, giving the lie to the disciplining of law into neat silos. We have labor laws and immigration laws and so on and so forth. Those are all blended and blurring together here. The police don't preserve liberties, they take liberties. They take liberties here with the workers. They do it when and as they see fit. They don't ever cross lines, the police, they make and enforce lines. And this is not a problem of this DNA sweep. This is enforcement. It's enforcement of a particular kind, these racialized workers. And it's a kind that racialized workers have come to expect in our society. We have this example of folks quite recently talking about feeling criminalized in a return from Africa. But of course, the DNA sweep, this kind of framing treats the DNA sweep as though it's a one-time thing. If everyone can claim to be criminalized, what's the value and use? We need to develop our concepts further. And in that, we need to go beyond the idea of racial profiling, which treats things as episodic, which constructs power in narrow terms, and towards broader understandings of racialized policing, which identify the pattern behavior that occurs, and of police power, racialized police power. Running out of time, so I'm going to try to skip a little bit here. Couple of ways forward. We should see this intervention here at the Human Rights Tribunal as a mode of labor conflict. It's part of the resistance that these workers are engaged in, which occurs at the work site, but well beyond it here. And then in that regard, we must see that our efforts must continue to be to collectivize the struggle, to resist the individualization of these kinds of tribunal hearings, and to continue in our practices of mutual aid, of continuing to build internationalism from below for migrant workers and our allies. I think quite importantly then, what we learned, what we observed in this hearing is that at some point, even though the powers that be attempt to invisibilize the violence that they're engaged in, it can become visible. And in that, we start to see that the past can't be quarantined from the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. That was also another amazing power-packed presentation. That was beautiful. You're getting claps too. Lalani's giving you like a shout out, so big up to that. And I think it's really important here, this idea about this individual exceptional moment. It's not. And I think that Adrian's point about the idea of racial profiling, not as an individual episode, but this is an ongoing systemic practice, why we start using this term about racialized policing. And to see this as part of a parcel of a broader struggle of resistance that's happening in communities, in workplaces, outside of borders. So I think the ability to encapsulate all that is, beautiful. So enough respect to you on that one. Now, turn it over to Dr. Vasanthi Venkatesh, who is a professor at the University of Windsor, teaches in immigration. She's also one of the co-directors of the Migrant Worker Clinic at the University of Windsor. She has a really difficult job of having to co-work with somebody else who's not a very good. The other co-director is not very good at the clinic. Let me just put it to that. So anyways, without further ado, we're definitely looking forward to Vasanthi. So please drop some science.
All right. Thanks, Chris. If you had not guessed already, the co-worker is Chris Ramsaroop himself. So you can imagine how grateful I am, how grateful the students are, and actually how thankful the university is to have Chris be the director of the Migrant Farm Worker Clinic. So all applause to Chris, in fact. So I would like to address three aspects of the DNA case. First, the nexus between the police and the employers. Second, the remarkable act of resistance by the migrant workers that this case represents, as Moilene said. And third, how immigration law has created a system based on racial profiling. And if you overlay the policing of racialized people in general, the systemic labor apartheid stands out starkly. In fact, I think every point that I'm going to say has already been made by Adrian, Moilene, and Shane. So I apologize for repeating it, but just bear repeating, I think, even if I cannot match their elegance. So during the hearing, and I see a lot of people who were present during the hearing, we heard how the police first claimed that the reason for the profiling, and they admitted that they were profiling. They admitted that the DNA sweep was based on the profile of the perpetrator being a migrant worker. So, so no matter the description or presence of an alibi, every migrant worker near the farms was profiled for a DNA search with any other description.
I'm only going to take 480 out of your bank account because you've.
Okay, so shall I continue? Okay. So why was that? So one claim was that the migrant workers were going to escape and leave the country very soon. They were going to escape.
I don't know.
Okay, so it was the deportability that was touted as the reason. But the reason why they were leaving was not because of the choice. Unlike other suspects in Canada, this was a group entirely in the power of the employers and entirely in the power of the Canadian state, with no mobility that is not regulated by the state and by the employers. So we have this highly surveilled and restricted group, a group that is defined not by the personhood of these men and women, but defined by the labor and immigration status, which is in turn linked to their country of nationality and thereby race. This group, this highly surveilled group, was deemed to be dangerous and capable of escaping the rule of Canadian law when every second of a migrant worker's life is determined by the law itself, as applied by the state and the employer. It's in some ways, and this is a crude analogy, it's like profiling every prisoner in a prison for a crime on the basis that the sentence was going to end and they were going to leave the prison. But in this case, the sentence was not ending with freedom, but with removal from the country by the prison guards themselves. And their lives, even back home, was still in the control of these prison guards. Because the farm employer decides what their livelihood will be next year and the subsequent years in this process called naming, which has been mentioned earlier. So we have a system in place that is creating this profoundly unfree labor, but which is also a paradigm of a form of racial or racialized labor apartheid. The migrant workers, we heard by the police themselves, were never deemed to be part of the community by the police. There is the community, and one community member was the victim of a terrible crime. And then you have the other, the excluded, the non-community, the strangers in that space. These racialized foreigners who have been coming year after year, individually, often for decades, and systemically for 55 years. But yeah, they're not community members who should be given basic decency and treated the same way. They will not be asked if they know the suspect based on the detailed description that was given by the victim. They will not be asked if they have an alibi. Their voices do not matter. They exist, to use philosopher Lewis Gordon's words, in a zone of non-being. In fact, their non-being, their constructed non-being, is so complete that even their physical description did not matter. There was a 54-year-old worker that many of us know who had been in the program for decades. It did not matter. A 5'3" brown West Indian worker, it did not matter. They were all suspected to be Black, violent men, every one of these people. And it should be noted what Shane said earlier, that the only workers who were excluded from the search were those who the white employer, or if I'm not mistaken, the white bus driver, would vouch for and say there was someone else. The workers themselves, their own voices did not matter. So one worker did dare to refuse based on religious reasons, and we heard that he was taken out of the program by the employer. And all the workers knew about that case, knew that refusal. We know who the worker is. And they knew that losing that employment, refusing the DNA, and what that would mean is losing their employment, but also being taken out of the program entirely and losing their future livelihood. And in spite of this ultimate use of power over the bodies of these Black and brown workers, these 54 workers went against all odds and decided to engage in this legal case at the HRTO. If there's one thing that this case stands for, no matter the outcome, is what Moilene said and what her word said, is the resistance and brave agencies that these workers are capable of, even as they're crushed daily by a legalized immigration, labor, and criminal justice system. Against all odds, they gave evidence from remote corners of the Caribbean and stood up to fight. I mean, it took Shane could talk for hours, I think, about the amount of effort that the workers and the people working with the workers, including Shane, took to bring about this case. And what that really means is that there is this myth, and Shane spoke about, Adrian spoke about several myths that prevails amongst people, academics and lawyers especially, that workers have no rights consciousness. They don't exactly understand discrimination. They don't understand Canadian rule of law and rights. They have no agency, and they're always afraid. They don't resist. But migrant workers resist every day, every second in their own way against racism and oppression. They rebel in everyday resistance that Adrian and several others have talked about. And at least now we have a stark example of it. So this brings me to what Chris said, that the importance to state that this is not an isolated incident. Racial profiling, xenophobic profiling of migrant farm workers happens in many forms on a daily basis. With the COVID pandemic, they were considered to be disease vectors by their employers, by the state, and in the towns that they live in. As a result, you can read in the news that employers have instilled mobility restrictions, even more mobility restrictions than before. It is assumed that these workers, they will not socially distance, they will not wear masks, they will not do the things that Canadians do as they go to buy groceries or do anything, do any social or cultural activities. And this is funny because this narrative exists even as the employers themselves do not follow basic health and safety measures in the workplace or in the housing that they have provided to the workers as part of their obligations as part of bilateral arrangements with the Caribbean countries and Mexico. Employers can act with complete impunity, and this impunity is supported by the government. And that needs to be stated clearly because we have people from the federal government in the audience today. So even as these employers do not follow basic health and safety measures in the workplace or in the housing that they have provided to workers, the inspections by the ESDC, the federal government that was in charge to show that the housing inspections were all right, was essentially a rubber stamp, which showed all employers as being compliant without any proof. And this is stated by the Auditor General of the government itself. And why was this done? So that the farm employers could get the funding from the federal government, that is the Agriculture Department, for economic loss in putting extra measures to take care of the health and safety of the workers. And what do the workers get in return for working during COVID when everything was shut down? Well, nothing. So they put their lives and health at risk for the Canadian economy, even as they're considered to be less than everybody else in terms of the measures. So this policing and the threat of being policed by the OPP, by the RCMP, or by the CBSA, that's the Canadian Border Services, is one way to structure the power differential. But as Adrian said, the seasonal agriculture worker program in general and in every way has created a racialized labor system where racialized workers are excluded, expropriated, and exploited while the Canadian state and employers make money on their backs. So the Canadian immigration law has created the system where the migrant farm workers are welcomed for their labor, for the national economic growth, but they have no personhood. Many labor rights, which are supposed to be based on personhood, do not apply to them. And their labor now makes them a suspect classification, a classification that's been used for policing, even though migrant labor as such has got nothing to do with a physical description. So their being migrant workers is enough to tarnish them as a group as being the foreign other, who can never be part of the Canadian polity, citizen, community, and who are forever potentially dangerous, even as they're working in one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Farm work is deemed as by the International Labour Organization and by countries all over the world as belonging to a 3D organization, which is 3D occupation, which is dangerous, and two more Ds which I forget now, but one of them is dangerous. Trust me on that. So the DNA sweep did not happen by chance. It was not a singular event. And the testimony of the police officers, for those of us who are at the hearing, reflected the values that has been designed by the Canadian system. And Adrian has gone through a lot of it, but I'll go through some of them as well. They said, we read out their rights. And we heard it was done in this very perfunctory fashion. And as was pointed out, not even all the time. And then they said, all the workers consented. So this idea of consent, that the workers are choosing their exploitation, are choosing their non-being, prevails across the entire legal system. They're choosing to come here because their lives are both so bad, they should be happy, at least they're getting this job. They want to give up their weekly holiday to earn more, and so long as they're consented in writing, it doesn't matter if they get no, if they're working during the time off. They want to work 80 to 100 hours per week in high heat and terrible weather conditions. This is the construction of the consent that the legal system does. At no point does anyone ask, what power do they have? Could they have said no? So continuing, we were actually very aware of their vulnerabilities. One officer opined on the first day, even as another said the very next day, oh, well, we gave it no thought. I'm paraphrasing, of course. They said we were so careful, we took their evidence out of sight of their employers, even as they admitted that it was the employers who were, as Moilene said, corralling them as if they were cattle for the DNA to be taken. Why was that? Shane asked. Why did you approach the employers and ask them to corral the workers? Well, it's because, isn't it obvious, we were entering the employer's private property. So what did that mean for the workers as such? The unsaid part? They had no right to privacy. They live without private lives. The DNA sweep was a deep infringement of their bodily privacy, but we know that this lack of privacy and absence of dignity prevails everywhere, from their workplaces to their housing conditions. When even in the height of the pandemic, they were squeezed into bunkhouses with one bathroom for over a dozen workers and several workers in tiny constricted spaces. The farm employer is Canadian, part of the Canadian community that the police leads. But the racialized migrant workers, we don't know them, said the police officers. And so is the system as well. We only know that they come every year and then they leave when the harvest ends. That is all. They're just racialized labor, not people. They're migrant workers, not people. Thank you.
Wow. That was another beautiful presentation. Thank you once again. So talking about the different categorizations and how labor is basically used in the expansion of agricultural production globally, and how migrant workers, irrespective of their living in communities for decades, are seen as racialized others, extensions of quote unquote property of the employers, and as subordinate to the interests of the community. So thank you for, I guess, 4 very empowering and powerful presentations. We'll open it up to questions. You could either use the chat, which hopefully my technology will enable me to read the questions properly, or you could just ask a question through audio, or if you're also on my WhatsApp list, just message me on WhatsApp. So those are 3 things. We'll take a couple questions. And once again, some dates that are coming up. So February 1st, we're hoping that will be the next and final chapter of the legal case, and you'll hear Shane basically, Shane is going to be extremely eloquent and articulate. So last day of hearings for that day. We'll be looking at some type of political action in January. December 18th is tomorrow, so we might have a small action where you can message me afterwards in Toronto if you're interested in taking part. Yeah. Oh, here is one question. What are the potential outcomes? Let me just make sure I have this whole thing there. What are the potential outcomes of the case? That's one. Why don't we take a couple questions? Bill Fairborn, I see Bill's got a question. Nice to see you, Bill. How is Ottawa?
It's cold as always, Chris.
Yeah, you didn't need to say that. We, you know, it's one of those things that we know about. Ottawa's cold. It's just cold.
I know.
Okay.
I know.
Sorry. Second question.
Despite all the hot air, eh?
All right.
But, you know, just like lots of love and respect to Justicia and to the workers and to the speakers. This has been an amazing, amazing presentation. I guess I was interested, I think Adrian picked up on it, but when Shane was talking about the arguments, you know, I guess they can't compel, right? They can't compel DNA tests, people to take DNA tests, but I'm just wondering the power dynamic between the workers and their employers, obviously, and I think speakers have said it, right? If the workers say, I'm not going to have my DNA tested, right away, they could be under suspicion, right? Their employer could say, why didn't you want to take the DNA test? They could create problems for them. We're not going to bring you back. So I'm just wondering if that element came up in the court proceedings, that power dynamic between the workers and the employers that compelled them to go to do it, despite that it wasn't consent, right? They were forced to do it. Otherwise, they might lose their job.
All right. Any other questions? So we'll take 3 questions for now. So the first question is around potential outcomes. And the way that I want to look at the potential outcomes are the actual case and what are the possible components if we win the case. And then we'll have a conversation, a larger conversation about the outcome of, and the other question around power imbalance and how did power imbalance play out during the 5 days of hearing. And the last one, will the names of the workers be cleared after all the infringement on their rights? That's a beautiful question. So those are 3 important questions. Clearing the names of all the peeps, the power imbalance, and what are the outcomes? Shane, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Yeah. I mean, I can speak to potential legal outcomes. I think Adrian and Vasanthi, phenomenal analysis from them. I think they can speak to some of the broader political and social outcomes. But legally speaking, there's a few ways this could go. Obviously, if the case is not successful, then the outcome is that the case is dismissed, and that's the end of it, pending an appeal if that was appropriate. If the case is successful, there's a number of remedies that the Human Rights Tribunal can order. It can order damages for the individual workers. It can also order what are called non-monetary remedies. And those that can encompass a number of different things. For example, an apology. It could, even though that's quite a rare thing to do, they could order that the OPP apologize to the workers. There's also what are called systemic remedies, right? Or also known as public interest remedies. And those have to do with policy, training, things like that. Because clearly having a human rights code seems to be not enough for the OPP to really get the message that they have to comply with this law. All law and all practices, policing practices in Ontario have to be compliant, not just with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but also with the Human Rights Code. So if they're not getting the message that they have to ensure that their policies and their practices are compliant, then the tribunal could make an order that their policies are revamped or new ones are created entirely. And they can also make orders as well with respect to the training that officers receive. Now, obviously, when we talk about institutional racism and systemic racism within policing, there's only so much that changes to policy and training can accomplish, right? The roots of racism in these institutions is broader than any singular order from any singular case can fix. However, there are possible positive changes that can come about from orders respecting policies and training. So I guess that would be my response on the first one. With respect to the other question about the power imbalance, absolutely. That was something that did feature quite prominently in the latter part of the case, one of the things that we learned that came out in evidence was that the farmer, one of the farmers, had written a letter to the police stating that he would be terminating the employment of anyone who did not comply with the DNA sweep. And that really speaks to this question of voluntariness and consent, right? When the employer made it known to workers that you are to participate in this process. We are picking you up in the field and we are driving you to the police and telling you, I'm expecting you to go in there and do as the police say. Or in other situations, descending on the bunkhouses where these workers are at in the evening and then bringing the workers out one by one to police cars at night and putting them into police cars and saying, you know, this is of course voluntary, but this is a chance to clear your name. Right, when the employer is sanctioning these actions by the employer, when the employer is sanctioning these actions by the police. So yeah, power imbalance featured very prominently, and as I noted, you know, we learned some new things during the case about just how deep it went in terms of the collaboration between the police and the employer. And then the other question, as I see it, is will the names of the workers be cleared? Well, for all intents and purposes, the names of the workers are, if you want to look at cleared in terms of the sexual assault case, the workers are no longer suspected of being the person responsible. The person responsible was ultimately caught. He entered a guilty plea. He was sentenced to prison. That's done. However, I think that when we talk about clearing the names of workers, it can take on other dynamics as well. The workers are still very concerned, as they've expressed to myself and to Chris and to others, about the fact that and I think it was either Adrian or Vasanthi who noted this quite correctly, or I think it may have been Moilene as well. The police lied, and this is not an exaggeration in any way. The police actively lied to the workers to get their DNA samples. They said that they would be destroying all of the data associated with the samples, and that absolutely did not occur. The only thing that they destroyed after taking the DNA samples was the cotton swab that was placed into the worker's mouth, which obviously is worthless, that has no value in any way. What they did not destroy were the DNA profiles, the data that was extracted from the DNA, information that the Supreme Court of Canada has said is our most intimate personal information that can possibly exist. What happened is that the Centre for Forensic Sciences, which falls under the same ministry as the OPP, they permanently retained those samples in a database. In addition to that, the OPP retained personal information on the workers, their names, dates of birth, addresses, physical descriptions, a whole slew of other details. They retained that data in another database called Power Case. So when we talk about clearing names, if the state is retaining DNA profiles and identifying information on workers that can come up in future investigations, we really have to ask ourselves, even though we know who the person was in this particular case who was responsible, are workers still being treated as suspects in future investigations because their information is being retained and it's being revisited automatically when these databases are searched? So it seems as though they are still being treated as suspects in some sense. Those are my thoughts on the three questions that were put out there.
Thank you to Adrian, Moilene, or Vasanthi. Any thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure. Yeah, that was great, Shane. You know, to Bill's question about the DNA sweep, like clearly there's two dimensions to it here that always works against vulnerable folks, workers in this case, migrant workers in this case. The first is that these sweeps are always cast in an overly broad fashion, deliberately so, right? Second, and relatedly, any attempt to refuse providing a sample just puts you on the list of suspect or potential suspect, whatever the heck that means. In both regards, what we see is a technique that is designed to impugn the people that it captures from the jump. So, you know, this might then allow us to talk about the remedies we're asking for. Well, look, we could have and ask for some revisions to DNA sweeping, to this policing technique. But, you know, no revisions are going to be able to stop what this technique is designed to do. It has to be put to a halt. And I would say, even more broader terms, we could ask for training of police, but we can't train ourselves out of the problem of racism in a racist capitalist society like ours. That's the order. That's the order they're trying to maintain. And so what we need to do then is to show that, yes, we're going to ask for certain kinds of, which prove that the system is designed to maintain this racist order. And therefore, we have to turn towards collective action to try to find ways forward. And I think in that, we start to see that claims like funding the police and abolishing the police are claims that are labor claims too. Part of their collective, and that would be troubling if that were so. I could go on, but hopefully, I just want to make one final point here, if I can. It's just to show my continuing respect for the work that Chris has done on this and other stuff, of course. But if it wasn't for Chris, from the moment this happened, I was getting texts, videos, personal testimonials from workers and so on, that was documenting individual workers' experiences, but also working to bring the workers together collectively to talk about this and to talk about ways forward. So much respect to Chris for all of this work.
Cool. And well, to all of you, really, you know, for like Claudia and Consuelo and everybody else who's been, you know, all the support. So much love to y'all. I know that Vasanthi and Moilene may have a few words on the first couple questions. And then we've got, I think the chat's on a fire. So if Vasanthi and Moilene have some thoughts to share, and then we'll move to the next round of questions.
Yeah, I think in terms of potential outcomes, and also about how the DNA happened that Shane was talking about. One of the things, I guess, that's more favorable in Canada than, say, in the US, and Shane mentioned it, is that you don't need to have intention, you don't need to have animus, show animus, if I'm not mistaken, in the police. The factual circumstances around what happened and why it happened is enough to show the systemic nature of it. But in terms of what it means in future, I mean, it's what Adrian said. I mean, the policing in some ways reflects what the Canadian society has sort of constructed in terms of risk and the construction of risk that a racialized person represents. And what should be done, right? So if, there has been an assault, we must act immediately, and that public safety, and you could hear that in the hearings. So we are the only people who can protect the public. We are here for public safety. So it is, all of this is being done in the name of the public. So it is not, the police is not an institution that just functions out there, right? I mean, we are the public that they're talking about, that they're protecting us from these risks that are there. So I do think, and I hope that this case brings up, is able to create the solidarities that that's supposed to have between migrant workers and other populations, between labor and race, racialized peoples, between labor and racialized and migrant justice people. So because it all functions in the same kind of overall system that creates these structures that the police, with a natural coercive power that has been given to it to protect the public, is able to ride on. That's the I think that would be a fair outcome in some ways.
All right, Moilene, would you like to add anything?
So I just want to add request communities, please lobby the sending governments to get them more involved, to get them to pay more attention to some of the things that are happening, to the peoples, to the workers when they arrive here in Canada, right? I truly believe that if the sending countries' governments were more involved or is more involved, there would there could be changes. There would be some of the things that are happening probably wouldn't happen, right? Because they are monitoring, they are supporting the workers here, right? So yeah, so that's my request for the sending government, sending countries to get more involved, be more involved, pay more attention, care for your workers, care for your brothers and sisters, your peoples that are coming here to work in Canada, right? We are doing our best to support and to help, and they're appreciative, but it takes the government as well. The government who plays a huge role, right, in this business of farm working and the SWAP program. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. So just quickly,
back to you, Chris.
Yep, we've got a bunch of questions here. So one comrade has said migrant workers need demands to equal rights, and I think that's definitely part of this case. And the reason why so many workers are coming forward is to say that they don't want to be just their voices not heard. They want to make sure that this act of resistance leads to real substantial changes. So that's to one comment. To Susie's comments about, is there a lawsuit? Yes, there is a class action lawsuit that's also upcoming in 2022. And that involves anybody whose DNA is being kept at the Center for Forensic Science. So yeah, so there's a second action that's happening as well too. Sandra, we're going to get to you. I'll read those in a couple minutes. And Gabriel's question about the outcome. I think the outcome one has been dealt with already. We could win, we could lose. There could be another appeal. I think what everybody is saying is that they're in here for a long haul to fight until there is justice. Now let's get to some of the other questions. And if I'm missing anything here. So I'm just going to read out Sandra's question. What types of policies do you feel would be beneficial to the migrant workers and the community at large to ensure that these incidents do not take place again? And how can the community help to keep workers safe and respected? So any of the panelists would like to start off with that? And sorry, is that my internet or is that somebody else's internet that says whack?
I think yours is okay, Chris.
Okay.
I can chime in briefly just because I'm going to have to head out in a moment. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this tonight and to hear what everybody had to say. I think it's been a really great opportunity. To respond to Sandra's questions, again, Chris, I think you and Adrian and Vasanthi and other folks involved with Justicia would be able to probably hit the nail on the head with those. I'll just give my 2 cents on it briefly. In terms of policies, I don't know if necessarily if there's policies per se that would be more beneficial for migrant workers. But I think if we're talking about systemic changes, the question of status, right, and security, right? One of the big aspects of this was fear, right? And earlier on in the case, remember this case has been going on for a number of years. There was quite a discussion at the Human Rights Tribunal about a culture of fear and how that kept migrant workers from coming out and trying to enforce their rights under the Human Rights Code. So I think, addressing things such as, in the contracts, there's this repatriation clause. At a very minimum, that needs to be removed so that employers can't just get rid of workers whenever they want and have them on a plane the next day if they do something that upsets the employer. But in terms of a longer term vision and a more systemically rooted one, I think we need to look again at this question of status and making sure that workers who come here and making these absolutely important contributions to Canada, that they have an opportunity to stay here and to create a life here if they want to do that. So that's one. And then I guess the second question, how can the community help to keep workers safe and respected? I think it's by trying to break down this invisibility around workers, right? Their existence, their very existence here is oftentimes unknown. Or if it is known, there's very little information about it. They're segregated from Canadian society. They're denied a voice. They're denied labor mobility. They're denied the autonomy to engage with civil society in the way that most of us would. So it's trying to make sure that a light is shown on that and to be able to amplify their voices and allow them to speak about their reality and to call upon the state to make the changes that are necessary to the temporary foreign worker program, and specifically the seasonal agricultural worker program, to give them that safety and security by having their voices heard and making sure that they are known and that people know about their story and what is transpiring. Situations like this, one of the reasons I think why the OPP tried to engage and did engage in this DNA sweep is because they thought they could get away with it. And there's a number of factors to that mentality of thinking that you can get away with it. One of them, I think, has to do with the rural nature of where this took place. It's kind of in the shadows of the province. There's not a lot of people there. But another aspect to it as well is the racial dynamic of it, right? And the status dynamic, right? You have predominantly white Canadian police officers who are seeking DNA samples from Black migrant farm workers in the middle of nowhere in Ontario. So we have to make sure that that the police are challenged actively when they engage in investigative techniques like this. And ultimately, some part of this has to do, of course, with policy and with which there's much broader systemic changes that go all the way up to the federal government. If we're talking about things that will truly make workers safer and more secure in Canada. Unfortunately, that's all the time that I have tonight. I'm going to turn over the mic to Chris and all of you folks.